The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this, a new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord. As Pastor Heidi mentioned at the beginning, my name is Liza Johnson, and I'm serving as a part-time pastoral intern here at Grace. I'm a master's student at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, and I'm so glad to be here this morning to share a message with you. The gospel readings that we hear during the season of Epiphany, the season we're in, the 5 Sundays after Christmas, follow Jesus' early Galilean ministry, a period of time lasting approximately 18 months, which was the longest single period of teaching, healing, and preaching by Jesus. Events from this period are recorded in all 4 Gospels, and we know more about this particular season of ministry than any other. In total, Jesus spent about 3 years in public ministry before his crucifixion, making this early Galilean ministry 1/2 of that time. These accounts of the early ministry of Jesus give us big clues to what Jesus was all about and what his gospel was all about. From the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, our reading for today, the author is quick to establish Jesus' uniqueness, his newness. Jesus does 2 distinctive things at the synagogue in Capernaum. He teaches as one with authority, and he drives an unclean or an evil spirit out of a man. These actions are important because they help the people in the synagogue understand who Jesus is. And in turn, the responses of the people in the synagogue can help us understand why Jesus' new teaching and authority are so important for us in our lives today. So what is this, a new teaching with authority? We live in a world today where authority can be messy and really dirty. We hear on the news almost every night how people in positions of power abuse their authority to discredit and hurt and damage the dignity and livelihood of others. We watch as politicians and newscasters twist and stretch the truth. We hear how lawmakers bend the truth to suit the desires of their party or constituents. According to a Pew Research poll, trust in our government here in America has fallen to 20% over the last 3 decades. That's pretty bleak. In this culture of distrust, it's embedded in our society. In school, we are taught not to trust everything we read. We are taught to question the claims in books and articles and presentations. We are told not to cite something unless that article or speech or book has its own citation, where you're ever told, don't look to Wikipedia for your sources. I attend the University of Chicago, and for those who know that institution, they know that questioning, investigating, and critiquing are at the heart of our culture of inquiry. In short, I don't think there's many of us who don't question authority, at least a little, and I think that's okay. Questioning of authority, I'm sure, I'm positive, existed back in Jesus' day. When this guy named Jesus arrived in the synagogue in Capernaum, I bet there were at least a few people who doubted the validity of his words. I bet many were distrustful at first. They know this is a new teaching, but how are they to know that Jesus' authority is different than the earthly authority they live with every single day? Different than the authority used by the scribes? Different than the authority of the Roman emperors? They feel it, but how do they know it? So let's set the scene up a little bit. In Jesus' day, which here is about 27 AD, the scribes were the authority on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. These scribes, these teachers of the law, were good at teaching about the law. They were really good at teaching about God. Their authority was warranted. They drew off their book learning and their seminary training, and they employed their various gifts of oratory and enunciation. They would teach what they had been taught, and people really listened to their authority. But unlike what we might experience today, in Jesus' time, a single scribe or rabbi wasn't the only one given authority to teach and to lead. Synagogue worship was subject to different kinds of authority. In addition to the scribes, elders or other delegates could appoint someone with their authority to preach. Ordination wasn't required. If a popular rabbi or community member was traveling through, like Jesus, they would be invited to come in and teach. So Jesus isn't doing anything particularly out of the ordinary simply by showing up in the synagogue. But there was something about Jesus showing up in the synagogue that might have made his authority be questioned. Because in a worldly, earthly sense, Jesus didn't have any power at all. He wasn't a king with political or military power. He wasn't a scribe. And despite this, when Jesus speaks of a new teaching, there is power and authority behind his words. Because when Jesus speaks, he's teaching like one of the prophets, as someone who has authority because of a personal experience with God. His knowledge is intimate, and he speaks like he's spent a long time personally being with God. That's a whole different kind of power. The power that Jesus is coming with tells the news to the synagogue that the authority of the earthly kind that everyone's used to, the power of the scribes, it's about to be overthrown. The authority he has, in turn, is the supreme confidence that what he does and says is God's will and God's truth. His authority doesn't lay in skills of oration and enunciation, although I bet he preached a really good sermon. Jesus' authority lies in the sheer power of his words and in the example of his deeds. His authority lay in his living as God's servant. I would be so confused if I was in that synagogue listening to Jesus. And yet they seem to trust this new authority from the beginning, or at least they begin to trust it. So why do they trust this new authority? Because unlike the emperors and the kings and the scribes with earthly authority, Jesus does something only good with his power. There's someone in that synagogue who is most distrustful of all in Jesus' authority: the unclean spirit. And in its distrust and anger at the appearance of Jesus and all that he brings, the unclean spirit inhabiting the man cries out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The unclean spirit, unlike some others in the synagogue, knows exactly who Jesus is from the start, and it is threatened. When the new authority spoken through Jesus starts to press a little too close to the unclean spirit, it challenges back. Why would Jesus come here and start to upset the status quo? Why come and start teaching in new ways? Why come and bring a new kind of authority? Why upset the power and riches of earthly authority that serve the unclean spirit? Because the unclean spirit is totally happy where he is. It's happy being in the middle of the community, spreading itself around. It's happy living in the world, living in that man. It's there, it's causing havoc, distrust, and separation from God. That's its goal. The earthly authority never challenged this unclean spirit. So before Jesus showed up, it was doing just fine. When the unclean spirit shouts out, we don't know if it's in anger or if it's in fear of losing the authority it has over the lives of the community. But it's clear that the unclean spirit knows exactly who Jesus is and what's happening. It knows that the status quo has been broken. It knows that the old ways of authority, the authority it profited on, are slipping away. The authority spoken through Jesus only needs a few words: "Be quiet and come out of him," to subdue the unclean spirit. And now the people in the synagogue can see clearly what this new authority is that Jesus brings, and they can trust it: the authority of God. Because who else or what else would have the power to silence an unclean spirit with only a few words? They know then that God's care for humanity and creation care for the freedom from bonds that keep us from God, like unclean spirits, is more powerful than any earthly authority. And when God's authority comes, it only does good. The people are no longer distrustful of Jesus' new teaching. News of him spreads quickly through Galilee because they have not only felt the authority and the power and the love of God, but they have seen the good works that this new power does. But you know what? When the Spirit is cast out, our text doesn't say that it's destroyed forever. The evil is still around, still trying to grasp onto someone or something that will give it a way to thrive. But its power has been uprooted. And that makes connection with God and God's power for love and freedom possible. It might not be easy, but it's possible. Earthly divisions are no match for the love of God. God's power and authority keep breaking through those barriers, through the unclean spirits, whether we are prepared or not. The people in the synagogue, they were unprepared, but they learned of a new, greater authority than the earthly authority. And they are amazed, and they believe. God's authority of love and healing, it doesn't always come to us the way it came to those people in the synagogue in Capernaum. It doesn't necessarily come with a groundbreaking sermon and an exorcism. I don't think it's happening here right now today. Sometimes it comes quietly when we least expect it, and I happen to think it usually comes quietly when we least expect it. When it comes, do we receive it as authority? Are we reminded of this power over our lives, this power of care and this power of love? Do we remember that this authority and power are not defined in the same way as earthly power and authority? This authority tells us that no matter how we show up, we matter. This authority has nothing to do with deceit, derision, and division. It has nothing to do with hate and war and greed. It has nothing to do with that unclean spirit hanging around, trying to find its way into someone so it can start building up a wall. This power can't be abused like that because it's not even comparable to earthly authority. And we can trust in this authority because we trust that God's authority is only seeking goodness and kindness and love. It's an authority that is so centered in love that it feels weird sometimes to call it an authority. But authority is something that has power to influence us. And God's authority has got power to influence us. It's got the power to influence us to tear down the barriers between us and God. It's got the influence to clear out our eyes and help us see how earthly authority can be manipulated. And it's got the power to keep showing up for us again and in us, again and again and again, teaching us to care for our neighbors and to care for ourselves that God so loves. It's the kind of authority that clears out the cobwebs of sin in society, and it helps us breathe easier. Jesus came with the authority to flip the tables of those who claim to rule with any sense of earthly power. And when we are so bold as to claim that as our gospel, as our authority, then we are invited to live as Jesus with the love of God in a new way, under a new teaching, a teaching that calls us beloved even as we live in a world that might tell us that we aren't. The authority of God is all about getting rid of the notions of earthly authority and power being more important than the healing power of God's love. Jesus' teaching announces that our earthly rules separating and oppressing people, our earthly rules that keep people stuck because of who they are or what they look like or whom they love, those boundaries have no real authority. The only authority left is God's, and it's an authority we can trust because it's a good authority. Amen.